Here in chapter 12, we dive a little bit more into the third phase of the British Empire, but with multiple things here. One is, for a while there, it seemed that this social democratic approach was working. The average person experienced greater prosperity, had more access to education and other things that, the average person wanted. Of course, there's always a whole lot of people at the same time that could have complained about that not happening. And we'll get into that, especially as we talk about the angry youth and some of those kind of things too. But we go from the social democratic processes that started in 1931 to about 1976. In some ways, some could have felt like it was working well. The author himself even talks about kind of being a young person in this era, or just old enough in this era to kind of have benefited and seemed like things were good. But then also when they began to change, 1970s and 1980s, it changed quite drastically again. So forth. But some of the things we'll also be, talking about here: nationalistic movements in Wales and Scotland, Ireland, especially. Talk about racism. Talk about how politics were being affected from other things around the world, and ideologies being influenced. And we'll also even talk about the decline of the church and the decline of morality. It's a unique discussion, in this chapter. You'll see, what we'll talk about the things that drove, some of the youth culture and youth culture movements during this session as well. I wanted to point back. I finished off in the last, or at least pointed to in the last chapter, discussions about the British Nationality Act of 1948, the advent of this Commonwealth concept, and how at that time it extended citizenship, to all people, of the empire, or of the Commonwealth, with overtures towards welfare for everybody, jobs and welcoming to the homeland and jobs in the homeland. But in reality, we see a lot of racism and even loss of jobs in some ways because of everybody moving into let's say London, for example, and it really created a lot of conflict. But the one I want to point out is the mention on page 44 of the Commonwealth Immigration Act of 1962. So 14 years after the British Nationality Act, we have this act of 1962 that is reversing some of what the first act had set forth, basically blanket citizenship to all subjects, British and royal subjects, so to speak. So here we have 1962, a reversal of that, and making other things not possible, making other things as a part of the process to gain citizenship, applications and kind of a proof of who you are and why you're trying to do it, things like that as well. But I see that it's interesting, even in the same window of time we're talking about, we even see a reversal of that, and that had been done at one point as this Commonwealth overtures to keep everybody happy and connected, and that's not working so good, and now we even see a reversal of that. Wanted you guys to, take special note of that, because the Commonwealth Immigration Act, you almost could think in some ways maybe it was going to further British citizenship, citizenship, but also instead it actually did not do that. It reversed aspect of that. Wanted you to catch that. Some of the nationalistic movements, that we see that was beginning to potentially even threaten the existence of Great Britain or the United Kingdom, so we talked about further in chapter 13 as well, were at the homeland itself. If you think about, the island where England, Scotland, and Wales cohabitate, right? And you think right there in that homeland, one of the members, like Scotland, of the United Kingdom here, really looking at breaking away, looking at, hey, they have felt disenfranchised, they felt unrepresented, they felt like maybe they've been the tail at the end of the dog so to speak, as an experience, as a part of being a part of this Great Britain that was controlled and ran by others in large. And so there's a lot of nationalistic movement, even right there in that intimate location of the homeland, let alone then, of course, across the sea a bit in Ireland, on the island of Erie, where we see here conflict that goes back to settings from the 1600s. Specifically, when talking about in North Ireland, North Ireland is predominantly Protestant. And geographically, it's a lot smaller part of the island, and then south of that, and the southern part of Ireland is predominantly Catholic historically. Well, back in the early 1600s, James I, who was a Protestant, he had been James IV, if I'm recalling correctly, of Scotland, and then when he was asked to be the king of all of England and Scotland at the time, he became James I of England at that time. Anyway, he strategically settled Protestant settlers in the north part of the island of Erie. And so some of the clash that now we're talking about here in the 20th century really goes way back to this implant of Protestants in that area. So what we're seeing here in the mid 20th century is conflict erupt to a point where then it actually even became status of a civil war. As we see, these tensions, growing as we've studied many times throughout the chapters, how bad a lot of the Irish had been treated as a whole, and especially those Catholic areas, which is the biggest area of Ireland. And now we see more and more, conflict erupting now, and uniquely, I think it's neat to kind of point out that in the north, where the Protestants controlled the area, Catholics were really discriminated against. Access to jobs, access to welfare programs, etc. And they began to protest, but they began to protest non-violently. They would do marches and so forth. But unfortunately, these non-violent marches began to be suppressed by violence, pointing to especially events in 1968, even the mention of this new group, the Ulster Volunteer Force, which was led by Presbyterian advocacy, which is just really just sad to think about. Here we are, part of this Christian college, and we think about Christians, and what a sad example that this represents, because Catholics and Protestants both are part of Christendom, right? We both believe that Jesus is Lord and Savior, and you can't get to heaven without Him, and so forth. And what a sad statement to the rest of the world, where you have Protestants and Catholics fighting, and of course even violently. And this lasted for a good generation, basically, starting here in the 60s and 70s, and it's just a lot of sad events. And I remember growing up, in this era. I was a little bit on the young side to some degree, but here in the United States, just hearing about these conflicts, and it was often publicized, around the world, some of the atrocities that were going on, and also uniquely and even sadly, is the North then very much having much more alignment often with Great Britain and its identity and Protestant and British and all that. It felt very much more British than it was Irish as well. Well, then you have Great Britain, and policies in London actually reinforcing and supporting the Protestant side of this campaign, further fostering, hate, basically, from the Irish towards British in general. And so we see a lot of that, and especially in 1972, where all-out civil war really had broken out and had begun. And it's really, really kind of sad aspect. We see this tension, we see all this happening in this third British Empire phase, and then kind of beyond in the next phases, as we see this nationalistic movements kind of resurrect again in many ways. Turning our attention to politics, I thought it was interesting. He just called it politics of identity, and it's very appropriate then as he showed us these different categories of identity and that what that represented, whether you were women's and women's liberation, which became known as women's lib, or it be other persuasions like homosexuality and your identification, with that group, that culture, that ideology, or it be racism with the Black Power conversation. So it's very unique to this era, and where so much influence was happening, and the politics being influenced by these special identities as well. Diving down a little bit on the women's lib, a lot of that was happening in France and America as well. So a lot of American and French influence on this whole women's liberation concepts and movements. A lot of they're huge to what they were advocating for were equal pay, equal access to jobs, equal access to education. In addition to that, they wanted access to free contraception and even abortion on demand were some of the tenets that they were advocating for. And a lot of this too, again, they would have cited as a reaction to being tired of being objects of man's desire, just at the whims of man's desire, especially because from a sexual conversation, and that they're just supposed to be objects, to them. They were reacting against that as well, and the society that was kind of built around a male-dominant, society, and how much that influence came from other countries as well as the own sentiments there in Great Britain, especially in the homeland. From the homosexuality standpoint, it's summarized like in page 461, especially centered on June of 1969. That still today, June is kind of the celebrated month centered on gay rights, even now. But here, that they really were claiming that much of their oppression had been due to the confinement of gender roles, like a gender role society, really has caused them to be an oppressed group, as a whole. And as they in the past had been treated as medical cases. Something was wrong with you medically, and they would be tested medically because there's something was wrong with you medically if you are of this persuasion, and that there would have been a problem that they weren't a medical problem that they weren't attracted to the opposite sex, for example, and just reacting to some of these things. They sought to decriminalize this concept. There's the movie, I don't know if you've been aware of the movie that's out right now, this Downton Abbey, a series that's been going on for quite a while. It's kind of interesting because if you watch that movie, you can even see this movie, excuse me just a second, phone going off. You see in this movie this being addressed where police force invades in this certain event that is going on, as at that time in the early 1920s, it's very much still a criminal act to be homosexual. So again, identity politics here affecting British politics, making much more way for, again, a permissive culture. And we'll dive into that a little bit more here as we look at some of the youth movement. Another key aspect of identity thing I mentioned as an overview, but drill down just a little bit more, is racism and Black Power. When we were talking about decolonization in the last chapter, and some of the suppressive, violent reactions by the state, by Great Britain, to certain groups, really helped foster even more militant reaction from those who are just tired of this whole racist thing going on. In Jamaica in 1968, that general strike that led to a lot of violent suppression there further also spurred others around the empire and the homeland to rise up into this Black Power and Black People's Alliance concepts that became a real militant response. to racism that had permeated the British Empire, our entire subject here, our entire course throughout this history that we've been talking about. It was very prevalent consistently, and it was beginning to react to this racism, but it even kind of became, they wanted to react to the fact that it seems like this racism was institutionalized. It was just that deep and that pervasive, and they had enough. And so we see like the Black People's Alliance coming to fruition here in this setting as well. Major impacts on British politics as well. Another concept here to mention is his introduction of Margaret Thatcher and Thatcherism. It became what was going to be happening next from a political, economic concept and convention, moving away from the social democratic phase that only lasted from 1931 to about 1976, that this Thatcherism was a move back towards, economic liberalism, meaning it advocated cheaper government. It wanted to reduce public expenditure. It wanted to use a deregulation of currency, but yet have monetary control. But again, it was a much more of a move back towards a liberal economy in a lot of ways. And even though it was also, a move away from the social democratic, characteristics, I thought it's interesting that he did note that Thatcherism as a whole also, though, however, did not advocate for this huge move towards a very permissive society either. It did actually still try to hold to some moral code, and it embodied maybe some of that Victorian code still in that sense. So even as it was trying to move from an economic, political standpoint back to some of the liberal economy structures, at the same time, it really wasn't a part of advocating this kind of a lot of the permissiveness that we see happening and coming on the scene here on this part of Great Britain's history. Our first question that we dove into said, does it make sense to talk of the death of Christian Britain in the 1960s? Does it make sense to talk about it as it's apparent, of what's happening here? Absolutely. We can see so much of the Christian and even the social code that, it came out of a Christian perspective, the social Victorian code, even at times if it wasn't, saying or advocating it was a Christian perspective, but it was still tied to Christian tenets and Christian morals, began to really fall apart and not really have a hold or a grip on the society in many ways. And he even cited a lot of facts and figures here that you see divorce, just becoming so much more prominent, illegitimate birth becoming so much more prominent, just a general permissiveness, while the main and the other side of it, inversely, church attendance is declining to all-time new lows. So we definitely see a reversal of what had been Christian Britain, so to speak, to just that much more of a society that almost didn't stand for anything other than just the whims of what everybody would, any individual would stand for. So we see, especially in the 1960s, a reversal of some trends. He had mentioned that in the 1930s, there was a little bit for a while where it was trending back to the institution of marriage, illegitimate birth still seen as not a good thing, and therefore it kind of had not continued to increase for a while there. But that basically from the 60s on, there's a huge reversal of some trends that at some point seemed almost to be becoming better, like more church attendance now became a whole lot less. Less divorce became a whole lot more divorces now. Illegitimate children situation, like talking about, having declined and now became a lot more again, to the point where now we see 1977 only 3.5% attending church. So it's a huge impact on British society at this time from a loss of moral guidance from a Christian standpoint. We see he even broke it into this whole discussion in some ways about the church and the morality, in with some of the stats I just mentioned right there, where the role of the marked life events like marriage, wasn't really being held at the church anymore as much as it used to. Let alone, like I mentioned, like divorce. He mentioned it rising by 400% in Scotland between 1960 and 1974, and then illegitimate births had doubled during that time. All part of this whole church morality. Then he also kind of pivots a little bit just from the social order, like as if that could be, we as Christians wouldn't see a separation of that, but from a social order, he then even recognizes this Victorian era of code, moral code, even collapsing as well. As it relates to laws like the decriminalization of things, decriminalization of gambling, decriminalization of abortion, decriminalization of censorship, decriminalization of homosexuality, decriminalization related to all these things, just paving the way for that much more of a very permissive culture. And so it's I like how he did that. And we look at the morality based upon the church standpoint and how it played less and less significant role in people's life, not only guiding them, but even there for their major life events. But then from a social order standpoint and laws, how it saw those reversals to where things that once had been criminal or things had been censored and so forth are now reversing. And then we also see then the family planning clinics as well. He mentions in this discussion that how a Christian nation or Christianity at one point, and of course being very prominent, it had been reversed so much that now the Christian voice really had been marginalized. He even talked about in highlighting the fact of the Festival of Light at the Trafalgar Square, where these are thousands of people showed up, which is pretty impressive, to advocate for Christian ways and Christian society. Well, the author points to this, saying, I don't know what the author's sentiment on it or not, but the way he said it was that really all it ended up doing in the end was just further highlighting Christianity's marginality in this society in Britain. Of course, that would be Christians' fault, for allowing that to happen. But I thought that was interesting that as he talked about some of those groups that were championing Christian ethics and Christian morals, that to him, the end of all that was it just proved how marginalized they had become. And that's a pretty sad statement, that even that voice was seen as something that had been marginalized. Moving on to question 2. What drove the formation of new forms of youth culture in Britain from the 1950s? Looking forward to see your guys' response. We should be pointing towards the fact that this baby boom era, which now had 1 million more by population of the age between 15 and 24 than any other society had seen, or any other historical generation had seen before this. A million more of this one age group between 15 and 24, he points to that. And it really set the stage for these social revolts. He talked about the angry young man and how they had become angry by being confined by their parents and their parents' perspectives, being confined by social norms that they were supposed to abide by. They felt confined by their inability to change status. Let's say if you had believed that education could be the ticket to another levels of society and prosperity, well, a lot of them became angry because it just didn't pan out that way. So he points to this angry man culture, and then it being fed. He used actors like James Dean as an example in the cinema, but also then, of course, pop music and the role that music played to just kind of create this voice of dissension, this voice of this angriness. I thought it was also really interesting that he pointed out that it's ironic that, on the other hand, some of the people that you could call of the establishment, some of the ones that enjoyed Oxford educations, etc., were the ones who created some of these TV comedies, like the Goon Show, that they are the ones that would have only had access to relationships, in the television world, to have pulled off coming up with these TV comedy shows. And yet, these TV comedies were very satirical, and they really represented anti-establishment messages. And I thought that was really fascinating. He's pointing out that it was of these established young people that even more the anti-establishment message was furthered even through these TV shows and these comedy shows, while at the same time pop music, was definitely creating these messages of dissatisfaction and angry against the establishment and so forth, feeding the youth. Tied to that was just access then to disposable income, where this age group before, in generations before, would not have had access to disposable income in the same way they are having now. Also, probably not appreciating all the struggles and the loss of life and everything that other generations had to go through to establish, freedom and democracy, or the things that they're taking advantage of now. But now they also have disposable income, and that relates to other advents like vinyl records, and how youth could get a hold of this music a lot more readily and a lot easier. And then he even mentioned how now you can imagine how these youth were able to take this music, a vinyl record, go up to their room, isolated from parents, and then just ingest, these messages, separate from the parents maybe even knowing fully what the messages of the music was. They probably weren't really paying attention per se. But so you have this big shift, lots of access to this pop culture, messages, disposable income, the ability to take a little record and go up to your room and just listen to it all by yourself, so to speak. And he points that out. It reminds me of our today's society with the advent of the cell phones and access to all the social media, and the problems that is even causing for our youth and people of all ages. In some ways, we're more connected than ever, but in some ways, we're actually more isolated at the same time, as we're just kind of mesmerized, and our brains are locked in on social media and iPhones. It's imagine you can parallel that to this society where the youth are having access to this new influx of information and influences, and how much that's quickly influencing what's going on. Then that really goes back to, again, why, as they're getting influenced from American music, music that's coming out in Great Britain itself, very anti-establishment, and coming up with more and more attitudes that were hostile to this Victorian code that everybody had kind of lived under just before that, and was really also tied into social democracy as well. So looking forward to see additional things you guys say in response to that question. And then the last question was, again, we talked enough really about this already, but it was how far was the radicalization of British politics from the 1950s influenced by events and movements across the world. And I really kind of highlighted it most, those things that we were talking about: women's liberation, homosexuality, black power. I think we could also maybe throw in there, some of the ideas on how even other economic things forced Britain to move away from a social democracy to more back to a liberalism democracy. As I talked about just British politics in general, I'm not trying to connect that to the identity politic issues, but how the IMF, these International Monetary Fund loans, at times would cause Great Britain to even lose more grasp on a social democratic approach because it was so needing loans that would make concessions and move more back to a liberal economy based upon the influences of the world and everything else that's going on, is my point, to bring that into the discussion. Politics being affected by these other issues, that we talked about, but then there's other economic things too that would have affected politics and the decisions being made, and then why something like Thatcherism could be taking over here and replacing social democracy. Pay attention to the way that these categories line up. Like I mentioned, women's liberation with their advocacy of equal jobs, pay, free contraception, for example, homosexuality, highlighting their oppression by a gender-based society, Black Power having risen to even representing kind of a militant reaction to racism. Talked about the nationalistic movements that were going on, erupting. We're going to be talking about that even more in the next chapter, and so forth. But other than that, that should conclude this session, as we'll wrap up with chapter 13 next week.